Have you ever wondered how a simple box of buttons could save someone's life? It was with the buttons from my mother's sewing box that I began to map my path to freedom. But let's take it slow, because this story has many pieces to stitch together. Good morning, dear viewers. My name is Gertrude Ann Jenkins. I'm 83 years old, and I was born in Milltown, a small corner of North Carolina blessed with rolling hills and cotton fields. Today I've decided to open my heart and share a story that's been locked inside me for so long that it was weighing on this old woman's soul. Sometimes we keep certain things buried for so many years that they turn to stone within us. And today, I feel it's time to break that stone. I was born in a simple house on the edge of town, one of those with a large dirt yard with peach trees, apple trees, and blackberry bushes. My father, Mr. Howard, worked at the textile mill in town, a hard-working man of few words who left before sunrise and returned when the first stars were already in the sky. My mother, Dorothy, was a seamstress with golden hands who could transform any scrap of fabric into a work of art. It was from her that I learned the value of every little piece of cloth, every button, every thread. Our house was small for the size of our family. We were 5 siblings. I was the only girl among 4 boys. Jeremiah, the oldest, was 5 years older than me. Then came Oscar, 3 years older. I was in the middle, Gertrude, as they called me. And then came the younger ones, Albert, 2 years younger, and George, who was 5 years younger than me, the baby of the family. Oh, how I miss those innocent times. Those of you watching from home, where in America are you from? Leave it in the comments so this old grandmother can know, will you? And while you're at it, give the video a like. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. This old lady here is very happy to know there are people on the other side listening to me, going back to my childhood with me. Life was simple, but it wasn't easy. My father earned little at the mill, and my mother supplemented our income by sewing for the wealthier families in town. From a young age, I helped her, first threading needles. I had good eyes, you know. Then learning the first stitches. By the time I was 10, I could hem pants and sew on buttons just right. The house we lived in was wooden, with one of those floors you had to sweep every morning so dust wouldn't rise. We didn't have an indoor bathroom. It was an outhouse at the back of the yard, and bathing was in a tin tub or at the creek that came down from the hills. But it was our little corner, our home. And as simple as it was, we took pride in it. The boys all slept together in one room on 2 straw mattresses on the floor. I had my own little corner, separated by a curtain my mother made from colorful fabric scraps. It wasn't a real room, but it was my space, the only bit of privacy I had in that house full of men. The school was far, almost an hour's walk. I went every day, rain or shine, because my mother said education was the only inheritance she could leave me. The boys went too, but Jeremiah and Oscar soon stopped to help with the family income. Only I continued, because my mother insisted that a girl needs to know how to read and write properly so she wouldn't have to depend on any man. Oh, how I loved school. It was a simple 2-room building, with 1 teacher for every 2 grades. Miss Ordway, my teacher, was strict but fair. She had the most beautiful handwriting I'd ever seen and taught me to love stories, words, books. She said I had a knack for letters and always lent me books from her personal collection. At recess, I always stayed with the same friends, Diana, Isabel, and Annie. We played Ring Around the Rosie and hopscotch, and sometimes when we were lucky, we'd eat apple pie with cheese that Diana brought from her home. Her family had a small farm and was a little better off than mine. At home on weekends, life was work mixed with the few games that time allowed. I helped my mother wash clothes in the tub, sweep the yard, cook the daily beans with cornbread. But there were also good times when we sat on the porch after dinner to hear my father tell ghost stories that made our hair stand on end. Jeremiah, my oldest brother, was my father's favorite. From an early age, he showed a knack for mechanics. He fixed everything that came his way, from the old radio to the rusty bicycle my father found in the mill's trash. He was smart, spoke well, and everyone said that boy would go far. I admired him, you know. Thought there wasn't anyone smarter in the world. Oscar was the quiet one. Didn't talk much, always had a closed face, but had tremendous strength. At 14, he was already carrying cement bags on his back without complaining. He started working early as a construction helper and gave almost all the money to my mother, keeping just a little to buy cigarettes secretly. He was never much for studying, but he had a different kind of intelligence, the kind you see in an attentive look observing everything. Albert, my younger brother, was the most like me in temperament. He liked to read, to listen to Miss Ordway's stories, and had a prodigious memory. He could memorize entire poems after hearing them just once. We played together. He didn't mind playing with a girl, and many times we hid in the yard to read the books I brought from school. And George, the baby. He was the joy of the house. He had a smile that lit up everything, even when life was difficult. He made up games out of nothing, made us laugh with his antics, and was my mother's apple of her eye. Everyone spoiled him a little, even my father, who wasn't one to show affection. Childhood, despite all the difficulties, had a certain sweetness. We didn't have much, but we had the essentials, food on the table, even if it was just beans and cornbread some days, a roof, patched but clean clothes, and, most importantly, we had the love of my mother, which was like a warm blanket that wrapped around all of us. Sunday afternoons were special. After service at the Baptist church, we'd come home and my mother would make a nice Sunday dinner. When possible, there was even a bit of meat. Afterward, she and I would sit on the porch with the sewing box while the boys played ball in the yard. That box was a treasure to me, full of colorful buttons, scraps, threads of all colors. Each button had a story my mother told while teaching me the more difficult stitches. This green one came from Mrs. Marlowe's dress, who was the mayor's wife. This gold one was from Mr. Jameson the pharmacist's wedding suit. I would imagine the stories behind each piece of clothing, each scrap. Life went on like this, simple and predictable, until I turned 11 and things began to change. It was as if a dark cloud, the kind that brings strong storms, began to form on the horizon of my life. But I'll tell you about that in a moment. Time in Milltown had its own rhythm, marked by the mill whistle, which played different tones at each hour of the day. Even today, I can close my eyes and hear that whistle as if I were sitting there on the porch of our house with bare feet swinging in the air. The town itself was a charm, with its sloping streets, its white church with the tall steeple, the colorful wooden houses. On feast days, like the 4th of July, the whole town was transformed. The streets were decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. Parades passed with lit sparklers, and the smell of barbecue mixed with apple pie filled the air. I loved these moments, was amazed by the beauty of it all. At school, besides learning to read and write, I discovered a passion for books. Miss Ordway noticed my interest and began to lend me books from her personal collection. That's how I met stories that transported me far from that simple reality. I met Mark Twain, Louisa May Alcott, and even some translated books she had, like Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe. Each book was a window to a different world, a possibility to dream of other places, other lives. At home, I had few moments to read. It was always between one task and another, or at night by lamplight, when everyone was already asleep. My father didn't see much use in books for a girl like me. He'd say books don't fill anyone's belly. But my mother always defended me. She'd say, knowledge is never too much. My mother. Mrs. Dorothy was an extraordinary woman, one of those whom life bends but doesn't break. Born on a farm near Clayton, she came to town as a young girl to work as a domestic servant in a rich family's house. It was there she learned to sew with the mistress, who was a dressmaker, and saw the talent my mother had. Over time, she received an old sewing machine as a gift and began to sew on her own. She met my father at a 4th of July dance. They married 6 months later, and so our family began. My mother taught me things you don't learn in any book. She taught me to have dignity even in poverty, to keep my head high even when there wasn't enough to eat, to find beauty in simple things, in a sunset, in a flower that grew in the middle of the yard, in a colorful fabric scrap. Life is made of scraps, Gertrude, she would say. It's up to us to sew these scraps in the best way possible. With my father, the relationship was more distant. Mr. Howard was a closed man, one of those who believed that showing affection was a sign of weakness. He wasn't bad, understand. He just didn't know how to express what he felt. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I caught him looking at me with a different gleam in his eyes, an almost smile at the corner of his mouth. In those rare moments, I knew that, in his way, he loved me. Sundays, as I've already told you, were special days. After church and lunch, sometimes we'd take the trail that went up the hill behind the house and go to a small waterfall that was hidden among the rocks. The water was ice cold, crystal clear, and we'd spend hours there swimming, laughing, forgetting for a while the difficulties of life. On the way back, we'd pick fruit, peaches, blackberries when it was the season, even some wild strawberries that grew on the slopes. We'd arrive home with our bellies full of fruit and our souls washed by the clean water of the waterfall. The evenings at home were always the same. After dinner, we'd sit on the porch or around the table, by the light of the lamp. My mother would sew, my father would fix something, or simply smoke his corncob pipe. And we, children, either did our school lessons or listened to the stories my father told when he was in a good mood. They were stories from his time as a boy, of hunting in the woods, of ghosts that appeared at crossroads, of treasures buried by Civil War soldiers. We listened with wide eyes, believing every word. George, poor thing, sometimes had nightmares after so much fear. And so was my childhood. Between the simplicity of home, the magic of books at school, the games with my brothers and friends, and the work that started early. Because in a poor house, a child becomes an adult before time. Until that year when I turned 11 and everything began to change, not all at once, not like a lightning bolt from the sky, but slowly, like a cloud that gradually darkens the day. So slowly that when you realize it, you're already in the middle of the storm. It was right after my 11th birthday that I felt the first changes. I remember that day my mother made a corn cake. There wasn't a candle or a present, but there was her affection and my father's smile, which was rare as a diamond. Jeremiah, my oldest brother, was already 16 and worked with my father at the textile mill. He had grown suddenly, like those plants that shoot up overnight, and now was almost a man with a deep voice and hair on his face. At that time, my body was also beginning to change. My mother noticed and called me for a serious talk by the washtub while we were washing clothes on a Saturday morning. "Gertrude, now you're becoming a young lady. You need to be more careful, have self-respect," she said, scrubbing a sheet forcefully on the cement tub. She explained the facts of life with simple but direct words, in her way. I didn't understand everything at the time, but I kept every word. It was around this time that I noticed Jeremiah looking at me differently. At first, they were just lingering looks when I changed clothes behind the fabric curtain. I felt those eyes burning me, even without seeing them, and I started to change more quickly, always afraid that the curtain didn't hide everything. On a rainy Sunday, when my parents had gone to visit my sick grandmother on the farm and had taken George along, I stayed at home with my other brothers. Oscar had gone out with friends, and Albert was at the neighbor's house. I was alone with Jeremiah, sewing a patch on the porch, when he sat next to me too close. "What are you doing, Trudy?" he asked, using the nickname that only he called me by. "Making a patchwork quilt that Mother taught me," I answered, without taking my eyes off the work. He sat watching me in silence, and then, in a sudden movement, he took my hand. It wasn't a brother's touch. It was something else that made my heart race with fear. "Your hands are becoming a young woman's," he said, running his finger across my palm in a way that gave me a bad chill down my spine. "You're getting pretty, Trudy." I quickly pulled my hand away and stood up. "I'm going to make some coffee," I said, and ran to the kitchen, leaving my sewing behind. I stayed there as long as I could, hoping he would forget that strange idea that seemed to have passed through his head. But he didn't forget. In the following weeks, whenever we were alone, he found a way to touch me. A bump in the narrow hallway, a hand in my hair, saying there was a leaf, a hug that lasted too long when I came back from school. Each time I evaded, each time I became more afraid. Until one day my parents went to the neighboring town to sell some of my mother's embroidery and buy fabric. It was a weekday. I had just returned from school. Oscar was working. Albert had been kept after school, and George had gone with my parents. I was alone at home, arranging the kitchen when I heard the door slam. It was Jeremiah, who should have been at work. "What are you doing at home at this hour?" I asked, surprised. "Wasn't feeling well." "Dad let me leave early," he said, but he didn't look sick. He had a strange gleam in his eyes, restless, like a cornered animal. I tried to leave the kitchen, pass by him, but he blocked the passage. "Where are you going in such a hurry, Trudy?" he asked with a smile I'll never forget. "I'm going to finish my lesson," I stammered, trying to pass again. That's when he grabbed me by the arm forcefully. "No, you're not. Stay here with me." What happened next still hurts so much that words escape me. I only know that I screamed, cried, begged, but nobody heard, nobody came. When it was over, I was thrown on the kitchen floor, trembling like a green branch, feeling a pain that wasn't just physical. It was a pain of the soul, a tear in the heart that seemed would never heal. He straightened himself, looked down at me and said, "Like nothing happened. If you tell anyone, no one will believe you. And if they do believe, they'll say it was your fault, that you provoked it, understand?" I nodded, unable to speak. When he left, I dragged myself to the washtub and washed myself, scrubbing my skin until it was red, as if I could erase what had happened. I cried until I had no more tears, and then put on my clothes, arranged the kitchen, and sat on the porch, looking at nothing, feeling empty like a cicada shell. When my parents returned, I had already composed myself on the outside. Inside, I was devastated. My mother looked at me in a strange way, as if she sensed that something had changed. But she didn't ask anything. Perhaps she didn't want to know. I thought it had been just that once, that he had done what he wanted and would leave me in peace. What a mistake. It was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. Jeremiah began to make up excuses to be alone with me. He'd leave work early, pretend to be sick, send the other brothers to do something far from home, and every time we were alone, it happened again. I tried to escape, to hide, but our house was too small. There was nowhere to hide. I thought about telling my mother. Several times I opened my mouth to speak, but then I remembered his words. "No one will believe you. And if they believe, they'll think it was your fault." And what if it was true? And what if my mother thought it was my fault? Or worse, what if she believed me, but couldn't do anything because we depended on the money Jeremiah brought home? So I kept quiet and endured, feeling increasingly dirty, more ashamed, more guilty. I started to do poorly in school. I, who had always been a good student. Miss Ordway noticed the change, even asked if everything was all right at home, but I lied. I said I was just tired. It was around this time that Oscar, my other older brother, began to notice something. There were days when Jeremiah approached me, I managed to escape and lock myself in the little back room where we kept firewood. I'd stay there for hours, trembling, until I was sure he had given up. On one of these occasions, when I finally left my hiding place, I ran into Oscar. "What were you doing in there?" he asked suspiciously. "Nothing. Just getting firewood," I lied. He looked at my empty hand, without any firewood, and furrowed his brow. "Are you afraid of something, Gertrude?" I almost told him right there, at that moment, almost let everything escape. But then I saw Jeremiah standing at the kitchen door, looking at me with those eyes that promised the worst if I spoke. I swallowed my tears and shook my head. No, I was just looking for something I lost. Oscar didn't believe me. It was visible on his face, but he also didn't insist. In the following days, I noticed that he began to stay home more, as if he were keeping an eye out. Jeremiah noticed too, and for a time, left me in peace. I thought it was over, that Oscar, even without knowing exactly what was happening, had saved me just with his presence. But I was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of an argument. It was Jeremiah and Oscar outside in the yard, talking in low voices, but with anger. "I know what you've been doing," I heard Oscar say. "I'm not stupid." "You don't know anything," answered Jeremiah. "And if you did, what would you do? Tell Dad. He wouldn't believe you." "I'll keep an eye on you, Jeremiah. If you touch her again, what will you do? Beat me? You've always been weak, Oscar. Always been second best. Dad likes me better. Mom likes me better. Everyone knows." There was a sound of a shove, of a fight starting, but it soon stopped. I heard footsteps moving away, and then silence. I lay back down, my heart beating so hard it seemed like it would come out of my mouth. Oscar knew, not everything perhaps, but he knew that something was wrong and had tried to defend me. The next day, Oscar didn't look at me at breakfast, but Jeremiah did, staring at me with a corner-of-the-mouth smile as if he had won something. That day, when I returned from school, I found the two on the porch, talking as if nothing had happened the night before. I thought it was strange, but continued on my way into the house. "Gertrude, come here," called Jeremiah. I stopped, my whole body tense, ready to run. "Don't need to be afraid," he said, still smiling. "I just want you to settle something for us." I approached slowly, suspicious. Oscar was sitting with a strange expression on his face. I couldn't decipher if it was anger, shame, or something else. "Oscar and I have a doubt," continued Jeremiah. "How long can you go without crying?" I didn't understand the question. "What do you mean?" "It's a new game we invented," he explained with that smile that gave me chills. "I say you can last 5 minutes without crying. Oscar thinks you can't even last 3. It was then that I understood the horror of what was happening. It wasn't just Jeremiah anymore. Oscar, whom I thought would protect me, had joined him in that sick game. I don't know what Jeremiah said or did to convince him, but there they were, both looking at me as if I were an animal in an arena. "I don't want to play," I said, my voice barely coming out. "I'm not asking if you want to," said Jeremiah, grabbing my arm forcefully. "We're going to the back." The back was a small tool shed at the end of the yard, far enough from the main house for no one to hear anything. They dragged me there, pushed me inside, and closed the door. What happened in that shed is something I try to forget every day of my life. Jeremiah did what he always did, while Oscar stayed in a corner watching, sometimes laughing, sometimes just observing in silence. At some point, I heard him say, "It's been more than 3 minutes and she hasn't cried. You won this time." When it was over, they left me there, thrown on the dirt floor of the shed, like an old rag doll that nobody wants anymore. I heard Jeremiah say before closing the door, "Tomorrow we'll try again. I bet she cries in less than 2 minutes." And so began the most perverse game someone could imagine. Day after day, when they managed to catch me alone, they took me to the shed and made their bets. "Today she cries in less than 5 minutes, one would say. "I bet she lasts 10, the other would answer. And I, in the middle of that horror, tried not to cry, not because of their bet, but because each tear seemed to give more pleasure to those monsters who were once my brothers. I tried to tell my mother once. I waited until I was alone with her while we were washing clothes. "Mom," I began, my voice trembling, "Jeremiah and Oscar are doing something bad to me." She stopped scrubbing the sheet and looked at me. "Bad? What kind of bad?" I opened my mouth, but the words didn't come out. How to explain that horror? How to put into words what I myself couldn't quite understand? Seeing my hesitation, she went back to scrubbing the sheet. "If it's sibling fighting, you all need to resolve it. I'm tired of breaking you up. You've grown up. You have to learn to get along." I realized that she didn't want to hear. Maybe she suspected something. Maybe she even knew, but she didn't want to face that truth. It was easier to pretend it was just sibling fighting, something normal, something everyone went through. That day, something died inside me. Hope, perhaps. The belief that someone would save me. I realized that if I wanted to get out of that hell, it would have to be by my own account. The months passed, and the game continued. Sometimes it was days in a row, sometimes a week went by without anything happening, giving me the false hope that it was over. But it always came back. Always. George and Albert, my younger brothers, seemed oblivious to everything. George was still very much a child. He lived in his world of games and fantasies. Albert, more observant, sometimes looked at me in a strange way, as if he perceived that something was wrong, but he never asked anything. Meanwhile, I was closing myself off. At school, I stopped raising my hand to answer questions. At recess, I stayed alone in a corner, avoiding my friends. At home, I spoke as little as possible, did my chores in silence, tried to become invisible. I thought that if no one noticed me, maybe they would leave me in peace. But they always found me, always found a way. It was on a Saturday afternoon, almost a year after that nightmare began, that something changed. I was in the kitchen helping my mother prepare dinner when she asked, "Gertrude, go to the shed and get some potatoes that are stored in the sack." My body froze. The shed, the place of bets, the place of horror. I couldn't move. What's wrong, girl? Are you deaf? Go get the potatoes. I can't go there, I answered, trembling. What do you mean you can't? Are you sick? Do you have a fever? No, it's that I'm afraid of that shed. My mother looked at me as if I had said the most absurd thing in the world. Afraid of what? Spiders? Rats? Don't be silly, Gertrude. You're too big for these whims. At that moment, Jeremiah entered the kitchen. What's going on, Mom? Your sister is afraid to go to the shed to get potatoes. Can you believe it? Almost 12 years old and afraid of the shed. Jeremiah smiled, that smile that only I knew the true meaning of. Let me go with her, Mom. I'll protect her from the spiders. My mother nodded, relieved to have solved the problem. Go then, and come back quickly. The food is almost ready. I had no choice but to go. On the way to the shed, Jeremiah didn't say anything, but I could feel the expectation emanating from him. When we arrived, he opened the door and made a gesture for me to enter. I entered trembling, already knowing what would follow. But then something different happened. Before he could close the door behind us, we heard Oscar's voice. What are you two doing? Jeremiah turned around irritated. Nothing that concerns you. Getting potatoes. Where are they then? We haven't gotten them yet. Ah, really? And why did you close the door then? The two stared at each other for a tense moment. I stood among the potato sacks, observing that silent exchange of looks, which seemed to say much more than words could express. Let's make the bet now, Oscar finally said with a strange voice. Here with Mom waiting for us to come back, Jeremiah shrugged. Why not? It's even better. It has to be quick. I bet she cries in less than 2 minutes today. And I bet she doesn't cry, answered Oscar. To my surprise, I bet that today she doesn't shed a single tear. Something in his voice made me look more attentively. There was a different gleam in Oscar's eyes, something I couldn't identify at the time. He continued, In fact, I bet that she never cries because of you again, Jeremiah. It was then that I noticed that Oscar had one of his hands behind his back, hiding something. Jeremiah also noticed because he took a step back. What are you hiding there? Oscar didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me and said, Get the sack of potatoes and go back to the house, Gertrude, now. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the nearest sack and ran out of the shed, passing by the two without looking back. I ran until I was out of breath, only stopping when I reached the kitchen, where my mother continued preparing dinner, oblivious to everything. Where are your brothers? She asked, without taking her eyes off the pan. They're coming, I managed to answer, putting the sack of potatoes on the table. That night, Jeremiah and Oscar returned home separately. First Oscar with a cut on his lip and scraped knuckles, then Jeremiah with a black eye and an expression of hatred that was frightening. What happened to you two? My father asked, seeing the state of them. I fell, answered Oscar. I fell too, said Jeremiah, without looking at his brother. My father shook his head suspiciously, but didn't insist. In our family, we didn't talk much about problems. We buried them deep, like secrets no one wanted to unearth. That night, lying in my corner behind the curtain, I kept thinking about what had happened. Had Oscar defended me? Had he fought with Jeremiah because of me? Or was it just another part of their game, some power struggle I didn't understand? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. Something had changed. In the days that followed that fight at the shed, I noticed a change in the dynamic between my brothers. Jeremiah and Oscar barely spoke to each other, and when they needed to, it was with short words, hard looks. At the table, they sat as far as possible from each other. In the room they shared with the other boys, they slept in opposite corners. My parents noticed, of course, impossible not to notice that cutting tension that hung in the air like wood stove smoke. But faithful to our family's tradition of pushing problems under the rug, they didn't ask anything. Perhaps they thought it was just a brother's fight, something temporary that would resolve itself with time. For me, those first days were strange. A relief mixed with fear. Relief because for the first time in almost a year, I could walk around the house without the constant dread of being pulled into some dark corner. Fear because I knew that truce could end at any moment. A week after the fight, Oscar found me alone in the yard, hanging clothes on the line. He approached slowly, like someone who doesn't want to scare a bird. Are you okay? He asked, without looking me in the eyes. I became tense, my hands trembling as I pinned a sheet with wooden clothespins. I answered dryly. Has Jeremiah left you alone these days? I continued my work, pretending concentration on the wet clothes. He has. He was silent for a while, kicking pebbles on the dirt ground. He seemed to want to say something, but couldn't find the words. Finally, he spoke quietly. He won't bother you anymore. I guarantee it. I looked at him for the first time, trying to understand what was happening. Why now did he want to defend me after months of participating in that horrible game? Why? I managed to ask. Oscar looked away, a mixture of shame and anger passing across his face. Because I should have stopped it from the beginning. Because I was a coward. I was afraid of him. Because part of me wanted to be like him, to be the favorite, to be admired. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I understood in a distorted and terrible way. Jeremiah had always been the sun in our house, and all of us, in one way or another, orbited around him, seeking his light, his warmth, his approval. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something strange. Oscar seemed to always be nearby when Jeremiah was at home. If I was in the kitchen and Jeremiah appeared, minutes later, Oscar would also arrive with some flimsy excuse. If I went to get water from the well and Jeremiah offered to help, Oscar would drop what he was doing and come along. It was as if he had become my protective shadow, although we never talked about it. We never mentioned the past, what had happened in the shed, the bets, none of that. It was like a silent agreement. He would protect me, and in return, we pretended nothing had happened. Jeremiah, in turn, seemed to have retreated, but I could feel the hatred emanating from him like heat from embers. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with those eyes that seemed to want to swallow me alive. In these moments, my blood froze in my veins, and I knew that he was just waiting for an opportunity, a moment of carelessness. It was around this time that I began to dream of running away. I was almost 12 years old, still a girl, but the idea of escaping that house, that town, that life began to grow inside me like a stubborn seed. Where would I go? How would I survive? I didn't know, but the will was there, growing every day. I began to keep things hidden in an old cloth bag, an extra dress, some coins that I managed to take without anyone noticing, a piece of soap, a hair ribbon that I got from Diana. It was little, almost nothing, but it was my escape plan, my secret hope. Time passed, and a strange routine was established in our house. Jeremiah and Oscar continued in that cold war. I continued in my constant vigilance, and my parents continued pretending that everything was fine. Albert, always observant, sometimes asked me what was happening, but I avoided the subject. George, still small, seemed the only one truly oblivious to all that tension. Until my 12th birthday arrived. There was no celebration, as always. In our house, a birthday was just another day, with the difference that my mother made a point of preparing some food that we liked. In my case, it was sweet rice pudding that she made that night with the little sugar we had. We were all at the table eating in silence. My father had had a difficult day at the factory and was more grumpy than usual. My mother was serving the pudding, and George was talking non-stop about a frog he had found on the way to school. That's when Jeremiah spoke. Just like that, 12 years old. You're becoming a young lady, aren't you, Gertrude? You're already at the age to marry. I froze with the spoon halfway to my mouth. That voice, that tone brought back all the nightmares I was trying to forget. What nonsense is that? My mother answered, furrowing her brow. She's still a child. Not a child, Mom, insisted Jeremiah, looking at me in a way that gave me chills. She's already becoming a woman. Soon there will be some boy interested in her. Stop it, said Oscar, dropping his spoon on the plate with force. Leave her alone. Jeremiah smiled. That smile that only Oscar and I knew the true meaning of. What is it, Oscar? Are you jealous? Are you also eyeing her? My father hit the table hard, making the plates jump. Enough of this conversation. What indecency is this at dinner time? Respect your sister. Silence fell heavily on the table. Jeremiah continued smiling, but didn't say anything else. Oscar had a face red with anger. My parents exchanged a look that I couldn't decipher, and I just wanted to disappear, to vanish from that house, that family, that life. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay looking at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, my father's snoring, The wind in the cracks of the window, the crickets outside, and planning how to escape, how to survive, how to start a new life away from there. But fate had other plans. The next morning, I woke up to screams. It was my mother in the kitchen, screaming like I had never heard before. I ran to see what was happening and found a scene I will never forget. My mother, on her knees on the floor, holding an open and empty small wooden box, the box where she kept the family's money hidden under a loose board. "They stole it!" she screamed, tears running down her face. "They stole our money, all the money we saved for Grandma's medicine." My father was beside her, his face a stone mask. The boys came one by one, attracted by the screams. First Albert, then George, eyes wide with shock, then Oscar without a shirt, hair disheveled from someone who just woke up. Lastly, Jeremiah. But it wasn't the usual Jeremiah. He was dressed with a bundle of clothes under his arm, like someone who is leaving. My father saw him and understood immediately. "Was it you?" he said. Not a question, but a statement. Jeremiah didn't deny it. He stood at the kitchen door, looking at us with an expression that mixed defiance and disdain. "I'm leaving. I'm tired of this misery." "With our money?" my mother screamed, getting up. "The money for your grandmother's medicine. How could you, Jeremiah?" He shrugged as if it was nothing. "You'll save more. I need it more than she does." That's when Oscar advanced quickly like a cat and grabbed Jeremiah by the collar of his shirt. "Give back the money, you bastard." The two began to fight right there, in front of everyone. It wasn't like the children's fights they had when they were little. It was violent, brutal, years of anger and resentment exploding at once. My father tried to separate them, but it was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. Amid the confusion, Jeremiah shouted, pointing at me, "Ask her, ask Gertrude what we did in the shed. Ask your dear daughter how she cried." The world seemed to stop for a second. All eyes turned to me, standing at the kitchen door, trembling like a green branch. My mother, with an expression I will never forget, shock, confusion, and something deeper, more painful. My father, his hand frozen in the air as if he had turned into a statue, Albert and George, not understanding what was happening, but feeling it was something terrible. And then Oscar, taking advantage of the moment of distraction, gave Jeremiah such a strong punch that he fell backward, hitting his head on the corner of the table. There was a horrible sound, like a coconut breaking, and then blood, a lot of blood, flowing on the kitchen's dirt floor. The following minutes were pure chaos, my mother screaming for help, my father running to lift Jeremiah, who wasn't moving. Oscar standing still, looking at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them, and I, paralyzed at the door, unable to move, to speak, to think. Jeremiah was quickly taken to the small-town hospital, carried by my father and a neighbor who heard the screams. We stayed at home in a silence as heavy as lead. No one spoke. No one looked each other in the eyes. It was as if we were all strangers suddenly, united only by the horror of what had just happened. Hours later, my father returned alone. His face was older, more tired than I had ever seen. He sat on the kitchen chair, looked at us, me, my mother, my brothers, and said the words that changed our lives forever. Jeremiah didn't make it. He died before reaching the hospital. The silence that followed was like a deep and dark abyss, swallowing all of us. My mother fell to her knees, a mute scream frozen in her open mouth. George began to cry, not really understanding what was happening. Albert hugged him, eyes fixed on the floor. And Oscar? Oscar simply walked out the door, without saying a word, without looking back. We didn't hear from him for the rest of the day, nor through the night. When the police came the next day, because of course they came, a death like that doesn't go unnoticed, even in a small town. He had already disappeared, fled, vanished like smoke in the wind. The questions began. What happened? Why did they fight? Was alcohol involved? Drugs? A woman? My father answered what he could, as little as possible. He talked about the stolen money, the fight, the accident. He didn't mention Jeremiah's words about me, about the shed. Maybe he had forgotten amid so much horror. Or maybe, as we always did in our family, he preferred to bury it deep, where no one could unearth it. The police noted everything down, They said they would look for Oscar, but they didn't seem very committed. In a town where resources were scarce, a young man who flees after a fight with his brother wasn't exactly a priority, especially when the evidence pointed to an accident, not a premeditated murder. In the days that followed, our house became a place of shadows and whispers. Jeremiah's funeral was quick, with few attendees besides the family. People looked at us on the street with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. At school, I felt the looks, heard the whispers when I passed. The girl whose older brother died in a fight with the other brother who fled. If before I dreamed of running away, now I felt trapped not only to that house, but to the tragedy that had befallen us. How could I leave and leave my mother, who cried all day in the corners? My father, who had aged 10 years in 1 week? My younger brothers, scared and confused. And there was more. A question that no one asked out loud, but that hung in the air like a ghost. What did Jeremiah mean by those words before he died? What happened in the shed? Why did I cry? One night, almost 2 weeks after the tragedy, my mother came to my corner behind the curtain. She sat on the edge of my mat, looked at me for a long time in the dark, and then asked in a low and trembling voice, "Is it true, Gertrude, what Jeremiah said about the shed?" I felt a knot in my throat, a weight in my chest so big that I could hardly breathe. I wanted to tell. I wanted to pour out everything, all the horror, all the pain. But looking at her, the thin face from so much crying, the sunken eyes of someone who doesn't sleep, the body bent by the weight of losing a son and seeing another flee, I couldn't. How could I put another burden on her shoulders? How could I destroy the image she had of the son she had just buried? "No, Mom," I lied, tears silently running down my face. "I don't know what he was talking about. We just fought sometimes like normal siblings." She looked at me for a while longer, as if trying to see the truth through the darkness. Then she got up slowly, ran her hand through my hair as she did when I was little, and left without saying anything else. We never talked about it again. We never mentioned Jeremiah's words, what happened or didn't happen in the shed, the real reasons for the fatal fight. It was as if we had made a silent pact to bury that truth with him, let it rot under the ground, where no one could see it or feel it. But I knew. And the weight of that secret added to the weight of guilt, because yes, I felt guilty, as if somehow all of that was my responsibility. It was almost unbearable. The months passed. Life somehow continued. My father worked more hours at the factory, trying to compensate for the loss of the money and the 2 oldest sons who helped with the income. My mother sewed until late at night, her eyes red from tiredness and tears. Albert, at only 11 years old, began to do odd jobs after school, carrying groceries at the fair, sweeping in front of stores. George, still too young to work, became quiet, withdrawn, as if he had aged suddenly. And I became a shadow. I went to school, came back, helped at home, did my obligations like an automaton. On the outside, I functioned. Inside, I was dead, or at least I thought I was. Until one day, almost a year after the tragedy, something happened. I was in the yard, hanging clothes on the line, when I saw someone approaching through the path that came from the road. From a distance, he looked like a wanderer, worn clothes, unshaven, thin as a stray dog. But when he got closer, my heart raced. It was Oscar. I dropped the wet sheet I was hanging and stood still, not knowing what to do. Run inside and call my parents? Scream for help? Flee? Before I could decide, he was already at the gate, looking at me with those eyes that seemed much older than his 17 years. "Hi, Gertrude," he said, his voice hoarse, like someone who hasn't spoken in a long time. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry as straw. "Don't be afraid," he continued, keeping his distance. "I didn't come to stay. I just needed to know if you're okay." I finally found my voice. "What are you doing here? The police are looking for you." He gave a sad smile. "I know, I won't stay long. I just needed to see you all one last time before I leave for good." "Leave to where?" "To the river. I got a job on a ship. I'm going to be a sailor." "Sailor?" The word sounded strange, almost magical. I imagined Oscar on a big ship, sailing through unknown seas, far from that town, that house, those memories. "Gertrude," he said, his voice more serious now. I'm sorry for everything. For what he did to you, for what I did or didn't do, for having taken so long to defend you. I felt the tears coming, but I held them back. I had cried too much for them, for all of that. Why didn't you defend me before? Why did you participate in that game? He looked away, the shame clear on his face. Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of him. Because part of me wanted to be like him, to be the favorite, to be admired. And I thought that if I did what he wanted. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I understood in a distorted and terrible way. Jeremiah had always been the sun in our house, and all of us, in one way or another, orbited around him, seeking his light, his warmth, his approval. Did you tell our parents? He asked after a silence. About what happened in the shed? I shook my head. No, never. He nodded, as if he already expected that answer. It's better that way. It would kill them with grief, especially now. We were silent for a time, the wind swinging the clothes on the line, the sun beginning to set behind the mountains. So many things unsaid between us, so many ghosts, so many open wounds. I have to go, he said finally. The train leaves before dawn. Won't you come in to see Mom and Dad? Albert and George? He shook his head. I can't. It would be worse for them to see me and then lose me again. And if someone recognizes me in town, it's better this way. I didn't argue. Part of me wanted him to stay, to face the consequences, to give our parents the chance to say goodbye. But another part understood his decision, his desire to leave that past behind, to start a new life away from there. Take care of them, Gertrude, he asked, already moving away. And take care of yourself. Don't let what happened destroy you. You are strong. You've always been stronger than all of us. And then he was gone, disappearing on the path the same way he had appeared, like a mirage, a dream, a ghost. I stood watching until I could no longer see him, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. That night, lying in my corner behind the curtain, I kept thinking about his words. You are strong. You've always been stronger than all of us. Was it true? I felt anything but strong. I felt broken, dirty, lost. But perhaps there was a strength in surviving, in continuing, even after everything, in not letting the horror of the past determine the future. Perhaps the true strength was not in forgetting, but in remembering and still moving forward. With that thought, I fell asleep, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have nightmares. In the months that followed Oscar's visit, something began to change inside me. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like a seed that germinates under the ground before showing the first sprouts. His words, "You are strong. You've always been stronger than all of us," echoed in my head at the most unexpected moments. While I washed clothes in the tub, while I helped my mother prepare dinner, while I walked to school, bare feet on the dusty road. Strong. Me. The girl who had been a victim for so long, who had kept quiet, had hidden, had made herself small so as not to be noticed. What kind of strength was that he saw in me, and I myself couldn't see? I was 13 at that time, at the threshold between childhood and adolescence. My body was changing, gaining curves that made me uncomfortable, constant reminders of that time of horror. But my mind was also changing in ways that I still didn't fully understand. At school, Miss Ordway noticed the difference. One day, after class, she asked me to stay a little longer. I became tense, thinking I had done something wrong. "Gertrude," she said, sitting at the desk next to mine, instead of staying behind the big teacher's desk, "I noticed that you've started to participate in class again, to raise your hand to answer, to turn in carefully done lessons like you did before." I shrugged, not knowing what to answer. It was true. Gradually, I had gone back to being interested in my studies, to getting lost in the stories of books, to feeling that old passion for knowledge that the horror had almost erased. "I'm happy to see that," she continued. "After everything that happened in your family, well, many in your place would have given up studying, dreaming, but not you. You have something special, Gertrude. An inner strength, a light that not even the worst storms can extinguish." There was that word again. Strength. First Oscar, now Miss Ordway. Was it possible that they saw something in me that I myself didn't see? "I wanted to give you a present," she said, taking from her bag a new hardcover notebook with yellowish pages. "It's a diary for you to write your thoughts, your feelings. Sometimes, putting out what afflicts us is the first step to healing the wounds of the soul." I took the notebook carefully, as if it were something precious. I had never had a diary. In fact, I had never had a notebook just for me. That wasn't for school lessons. "Thank you, Miss Ordway," I murmured, moved. "Use it well," she answered with a smile. "Words have power, Gertrude, power to destroy, but also to heal, to transform. Never forget that." That night, hidden behind my patchwork curtain, I opened the diary for the first time. The blank page stared at me. A challenge, a possibility. What to write, how to begin to pour out everything that had been locked inside me for so long. I took the pencil and hesitantly wrote a single line. "My name is Gertrude, and I am trying to be strong." It was the beginning. In the following nights, after everyone was asleep, I wrote by the weak light of a candle. At first, they were simple things of everyday life. What I had eaten for lunch, what the teacher had taught, a beautiful flower I had seen on the way to school. But gradually I began to write about deeper things, about missing Oscar, despite everything, about the nightmares that still woke me some nights, sweaty and trembling, about the guilt I felt for Jeremiah's death, even knowing it wasn't my fault, and finally, about what had happened in the shed. For the first time, I put into words all the horror, all the humiliation, all the pain. I wrote page after page, tears staining the paper, my hand aching from gripping the pencil so tightly. When I finished, it was almost dawn, and I felt different, not healed, not completely. The wound was still there, but it was as if I had cleaned it, removed some of the poison that had been infecting it for so long. Miss Ordway's words came back to my mind. Words have power. She was right. Putting my pain on paper had been like taking a weight off my shoulders, even if momentarily. If written words had this power, what power would spoken words have? This question kept hammering in my head for days, weeks. I observed how people used words around me. How my father, with a few harsh words, could make Albert cower in fear. How my mother, with sweet words, calmed George after a nightmare. How Diana, my friend from school, with poisonous words disguised as concern, spread gossip about the other girls. Words so simple, so common, and yet so powerful. It was around this time that Albert, then 12 years old, began to change. He had always been the most like me, quiet, studious, observant. But after the tragedy with our older brothers, something in him transformed. He began to hang out with older boys, to skip school, to come home smelling like cigarettes. My parents, still immersed in their own grief, barely noticed, or if they noticed, didn't have the energy to deal with one more problem. One afternoon, coming back from school, I found Albert hidden behind the shed, where we kept firewood, smoking a cigarette with a boy I didn't know. When he saw me, Albert threw the cigarette on the ground, stepping on it quickly. "What are you looking at?" he asked defensively. "Nothing," I answered, continuing on my way. But that scene stayed with me. Albert was changing, transforming, following a dangerous path that I feared could lead him to become someone like Jeremiah. The idea gave me chills. That night I wrote in my diary about this concern, about how I saw in Albert signs that scared me, about how I wanted to help him, but didn't know how, about how I feared that history would repeat itself in some terrible way that I still couldn't imagine. After writing, I spent some time looking at the pages filled with my small and tight handwriting. And then, like lightning on a clear day, I had an idea. What if I used the power of words not only to express my pain, but to change things, to intervene before it was too late? The next day, I waited for Albert to come back from school. I was alone at home. My mother had gone to deliver some sewing. My father was at work, and George was playing at a friend's house. It was the perfect opportunity. When Albert came in, throwing his book bag in a corner, I approached him in the kitchen. "You won't believe what I heard," I began, keeping my voice low, like someone telling a secret. He looked at me suspiciously. "What? That friend of yours? The one who was smoking with you yesterday?" I heard him talking with other boys in the square. He was laughing, saying that you're a fool, that you only hang out with him because he lets you smoke the leftovers of his cigarettes. The lie came out easy, fluid. It didn't even seem like it was me speaking. But the effect was immediate. Albert's face turned red with anger. Tommy said that? That son of a... He said that? I confirmed, feigning indignation. He said you're like a little dog, following him everywhere, doing everything he orders. Albert punched the wall, furious. I'm going to break his face tomorrow. Who does he think he is? I don't know if it's worth it, I answered, shrugging. He's older, stronger. And besides, Mom would find out that you've been smoking secretly. He stopped, thoughtful. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, evaluating the options. But if I were you, I continued casually, I would stop hanging out with him. Show that I don't need him for anything. There are much better people to be friends with, people who really respect you. Albert didn't answer, but I saw that my words had planted a seed. In the following days, I noticed that he no longer ran out after school to meet his friends. He began to come straight home, or sometimes stayed in the library as he did before. A small victory, small but significant. I had used words, lies, it's true, but with good intention, to change the course of things, to protect my brother from a destructive path. The feeling of power was intoxicating. I, who for so long had felt powerless, victim of circumstances, of the perverse desires of others, now had found a way to act, to influence, to control. In the following weeks, I continued my silent campaign. When I saw Albert talking with some boy that I considered a bad influence, I found a way to sow discord between them. A word here, an insinuation there. Nothing too obvious, nothing that could be traced back to me. Just small linguistic poisons carefully administered. And it worked. Albert began to move away from those boys, gradually returning to being the studious and quiet boy he had always been. He began to seek me out more, to ask for help with lessons, to want to read the books that Miss Ordway lent me. My experiment with the power of words had been a success, but there was still a bigger problem, a shadow that loomed over our house, our family, my nights of sleep. George, my youngest brother, now 9 years old, was also changing, but in a different way from Albert. He had always been a cheerful boy, full of life, the ray of sunshine of our family. But after the tragedy, after the loss of the 2 older brothers, one to death, the other to flight, something in him went out. He became quiet, withdrawn. He had frequent nightmares, waking the house with his screams in the middle of the night. At school, the teacher reported that he had difficulty concentrating, making friends, participating in activities. My parents, still struggling with their own grief, didn't have the energy to deal with this. My mother gave him home remedies to help him sleep better. My father occasionally lost patience and yelled at him, but most of the time, George was left to his own devices, a little ghost in our house of ghosts. It broke my heart to see him like this. Of all of us, he was the one who least understood what had happened, why our family had imploded overnight. I tried several times to talk to him, but he closed up like a shell, answering only with monosyllables or shrugging his shoulders. One night I woke up to his screams, another nightmare. I ran to the boy's room and found him sitting on the bed trembling, his eyes wide with terror. Albert, lying on the mattress next to him, just turned to the wall, pulling the blanket over his head, too accustomed to that scene to care. I sat on the edge of George's bed and hugged him, feeling his small, thin body tremble against mine. "It's okay," I whispered, stroking his hair. "It was just a bad dream. It's over now." He clung to me like a castaway to a piece of wood. "I dreamed about Jeremiah," he whispered back, his voice breaking. He was all covered in blood, calling me to go with him. A chill ran down my spine. "It was just a dream," I repeated, trying to convince him and myself. "Jeremiah can't take you anywhere." "But he seemed so real," insisted George, "and so angry. He said I would regret it, that the whole family would regret it." That worried me. It wasn't the first time that George had dreamed of Jeremiah, but it had never been so vivid, so threatening. "George," I said after a moment of hesitation, "do you remember what happened that day? The day Jeremiah left?" He nodded slowly. "I remember that he and Oscar fought, that there was a lot of blood, that Dad took him to the hospital, but he didn't come back. And do you remember why they fought? He furrowed his brow, thinking. Because of money, wasn't it? Jeremiah took Grandma's money. Yes, but do you remember that he said something about me? About the shed? George shook his head. No, I just remember the fight, the blood. And then Oscar disappeared too. I breathed a sigh of relief. At least he had been spared that sordid detail. Or if he had heard, he hadn't understood what it meant. Jeremiah was sick, George, I said, choosing my words carefully. Not in the head, as we think, but in the heart. He did bad things, hurt people. George looked at me with those large, innocent eyes. Did he hurt you, Trudy? The direct question caught me by surprise. For a moment I thought about lying, about protecting him from the horrible truth. But then I remembered the power of words, not only to hurt, but also to heal, to clarify, to liberate. Yes, I answered, my voice low but firm. He hurt me, in a way that no one should hurt another person, especially a sister. And Oscar? Oscar? At the beginning, he let Jeremiah do this. He even participated in a way, but then he changed his mind, decided to protect me. That's why they fought that day. George processed this information for a moment, his little face serious, thoughtful. So was Oscar good or bad? I sighed. How to explain these complexities to a child? How to make him understand that people aren't totally good or bad? That we all have shadows and lights inside us, fighting for dominance. Oscar was human, I answered finally. He did bad things, but he also did good things. In the end, he chose to do the right thing, even if in a wrong way. I don't know if he understood completely, but he seemed to accept this explanation. We remained silent for a time, hugged in the darkness of the room, each lost in our own thoughts. George, I said after a while, I want you to know something. Jeremiah can't hurt you, not in dreams, not in real life. He's gone, and he's not coming back. And I will never let anyone hurt you like he hurt me. Understand? He nodded, squeezing my hand. I understand, Trudy. And if I have more nightmares, can I call you always, no matter the time? He smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen in him in a long time. Okay. Can I sleep with you tonight? You can, I answered, helping him get up. Come, let's go to my little corner. That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with George. In the days and weeks that followed, I noticed a change in him. The nightmares decreased. He went back to smiling more, playing, being a bit of that cheerful boy he had been before the tragedy. He began to follow me around the house like a little shadow, wanting to help with the chores, wanting to hear the stories that I read in Miss Ordway's books, wanting to always be close by. And I discovered that I liked this role of protector, of mentor. It was as if, after so long being a victim, I finally could be something else. A savior, a guardian, a light in the darkness for someone who needed it. But there was still a shadow that needed to be confronted, a presence in our house that, even after almost 2 years, still poisoned the air we breathed, still haunted our nights, still governed our lives in ways that not everyone perceived. Jeremiah's ghost. No, not a literal ghost, of course. I didn't believe that his spirit wandered the corridors of our house, despite George's nightmares. The ghost I refer to was more insidious, more persistent. It was his presence in our memories, in our silences, in our unspoken interactions. It was in my mother's eyes when she looked at the empty chair at the table where he used to sit. It was in my father's refusal to talk about the past, in his insistence on pretending that nothing had happened. It was in the way we avoided certain parts of the house, certain subjects, certain memories, and more disturbing. It was in the way I sometimes saw Albert looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. A look that dangerously reminded me of Jeremiah's look before everything started, a look that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was one of these looks on a Sunday afternoon, while I was helping my mother hang clothes on the line, that made me realize that I still wasn't safe, that the cycle could repeat itself if I didn't do something to break it definitively. I returned to my diary that night, writing frenetically by candlelight, trying to organize my thoughts, my fears, my plans. If words had the power to change Albert's behavior with his friends, to comfort George in his nightmares, What power would they have to exorcise once and for all Jeremiah's ghost from our house, from our lives? The answer came to me as a revelation, clear and terrible at the same time. To defeat the ghost, I needed to confront it, bring to light what had remained in the shadows for so long, break the silence that bound us, that suffocated us, that kept us trapped in that limbo of unresolved pain. I needed to tell the truth. Not the whole truth. Maybe there were sordid details that no one needed to know, horrors that were better left buried, but the essence, the core of that darkness that had poisoned our family, this needed to be exposed, confronted, processed. Having made the decision, the next step was the most difficult. How to do this? With whom to start? How to put into words something so terrible, so painful, that I had hidden for so long, even from myself? I decided to start with Albert. He was the oldest after me now, the one who had the most memories of the time before the tragedy, and also the one who worried me most with those looks. That latent anger that sometimes exploded for trivial reasons, that unresolved admiration for the older brother he had lost. I waited for an opportunity that came on an afternoon when my parents had gone to the market in the neighboring town, taking George with them. We were alone at home, Albert and I. He was in the yard fixing a broken chair, a task that before would have been Jeremiah's. I approached casually, offering a glass of water that he accepted with a nod of his head. I watched him work for a while, gathering courage for what was to follow. "Albert," I began, my voice firmer than I felt inside, "I need to tell you something about Jeremiah, about what really happened before he left." He stopped what he was doing, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "What about it?" I took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Do you remember what he said that day about me in the shed?" Albert furrowed his brow, trying to remember. "More or less. He said something about you crying, didn't he?" "Yes," I confirmed, feeling my heart accelerate. "He said to ask me about what we did in the shed, about how I cried, and I never told anyone what really happened there, what they did to me." Albert put down the hammer he was holding. All his attention turned to me. "Now, they who?" "Jeremiah and Oscar. At the beginning it was just Jeremiah, but then Oscar also participated. And then, with words that at first were hesitant, but that gained strength as I advanced, I told my brother an edited version of the horror that I had lived. I told about the abuses, about the bets, about the humiliation, about the constant fear. I didn't go into graphic details, but I said enough for him to understand the monstrosity of what had happened, especially to us. While I spoke, I observed his face change, shock, then anger, then a kind of horrified understanding. When I finished, he was pale, his hands trembling at his side. "Why did you never tell?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you ask for help? From whom? Mom and Dad barely noticed what was happening under their noses, and I was afraid that they wouldn't believe me. Afraid of what Jeremiah would do if I told, afraid of destroying what was left of our family." He nodded slowly, processing everything. "And Oscar? Did he really participate in this?" "At the beginning, yes. But then he changed his mind. He began to protect me. That's why they fought that day. It wasn't just about the money, it was because of me." Albert remained silent for a long time, looking at the ground, at his hands, anywhere but at me. Finally, he raised his eyes, and what I saw in them surprised me. There was no judgment, no disbelief. There was only a deep sadness and something more, a kind of determination. "I'm sorry, Gertrude," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry that this happened to you, that you went through this alone, that I didn't notice, didn't help." "You were just a child," I answered, feeling a knot in my throat. "You had no way of knowing, no way of helping." "Even so," he insisted. "I should have noticed something. I should have, I don't know, done something. It's not your fault," I stated with more conviction than I had felt in a long time. "The fault is theirs. Only theirs." He nodded, seeming a little older, a little wiser suddenly. "Why are you telling me this now?" It was the question I feared, and at the same time, the one I most needed to answer. "Because I'm afraid," I admitted, my voice low. "Afraid that what happened isn't really over, that Jeremiah's spirit is still here somehow. Not as a ghost, but as a shadow, an influence, And I'm afraid that influence might reach you or George. He looked at me, confused. What do you mean? Sometimes, I said, choosing my words carefully, I see you look at me in a way that reminds me of him, or speak in a way that reminds me of him, and it scares me, Albert. It scares me a lot. He paled even more, seeming genuinely horrified. I would never do something like that, Gertrude. Never. I know, I hastened to say, seeing the pain in his eyes. I know you wouldn't intentionally, but Jeremiah, he had a way of influencing people, of making them want to be like him, want his approval. He did it with Oscar, and I fear that even after death, he might be doing it with you. Albert remained silent again, thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice had a determination I had never heard before. It won't happen, he stated. I won't let it. I never wanted to be like Jeremiah. I always wanted to be like Dad, hard-working, honest, or like you, intelligent, strong. Never like him. I don't know why, but I believed him. Maybe it was the conviction in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, or maybe it was just my desperate need to believe, to trust, to have at least one ally in that house of shadows. Thank you, I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, for believing me, for understanding. He stood up, hesitated for a moment, and then did something he hadn't done since we were little. He hugged me, an awkward teenage hug, but sincere. It will never happen again, he promised, his voice muffled against my hair. I won't let it. I'll protect you, Gertrude, and George, too. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could overcome the shadows of the past, that we could rebuild something from the ruins of our family, that the story didn't need to repeat itself. The cycle could be broken. The power of words. Once again, it had proved its value, not just to hurt, to manipulate, to destroy, but to heal, to unite, to transform. And as we walked back into the house together, side by side, I felt that I had taken an important step toward my own liberation. I was no longer alone with my secrets, with my fears. I had an ally, a protector, a real brother. Jeremiah's ghost was still there in the shadows of our house, in the memories that would never completely disappear. But now, for the first time, I felt that maybe, just maybe, we could defeat it together. The months that followed my conversation with Albert brought a peace that I never imagined would be possible in our house. It was as if those words, that shared truth, had opened a window in a long-closed room, letting in fresh air and sunlight. Not that everything had changed overnight. Of course, the wounds were still there, deep and painful. But now, there was also something new, an alliance, an understanding, a mutual protection. Albert kept his promise to protect me and George too. I noticed how he became more attentive, more present. If before he lived in his own world, now he always seemed to be watching who entered the house, who approached me or our youngest brother. When my father drank too much and got that dangerous look that we all knew well, it was Albert who invented an excuse to get me out of the room, to take George outside, to get us away from danger. I was almost 14 at that time, and Albert was 13. We were still children in many ways, but life had already taught us lessons that many adults never learn about pain, about loss, about the evil that can exist, even within those who should protect us, but also about strength, about resilience, about the power to rebuild from the pieces. It was at this time that I received news that would change everything again. Miss Ordway called me after class, her face serious, but with a gleam of excitement in her eyes. "Gertrude," she said, sitting next to me, as she did when she had something important to tell. "Remember that essay contest you participated in last month about the America we want?" I nodded, remembering the essay I had written with such care, talking about a country without hunger, without inequality, where all children could study and dream. "You won," she announced, a smile opening on her face. "You won first place in the youth category. And do you know what that means? You're going to receive a scholarship to continue your studies at St. Mary's School in Richmond, all paid, boarding at the dormitory, food, uniforms, books, everything." I was in shock for a moment, unable to process what that meant. A scholarship, a boarding school in Richmond, leaving Milltown, my house, my family. But my parents will never let me, I said, reality imposing itself on the dream. They need me at home to help with everything. Miss Ordway squeezed my hand, her look determined. Let me talk to them. I'll explain the unique opportunity this is, how it can change your life. And if necessary, I'll talk to Reverend Anderson too, for him to convince your parents. I left school that day with my head in the clouds, my heart beating between fear and hope. A chance to leave, to study, to have a different future. It was everything I had always dreamed of, and at the same time, it deeply frightened me. How would it be to live far from home, far from Albert and George? How would they be without me to protect them? When I got home, I didn't tell anyone anything. I wanted to wait to see if Miss Ordway would really be able to convince my parents before creating hopes or fears. But that night, lying in my corner behind the patchwork curtain, I couldn't sleep. My mind was buzzing with possibilities, with dreams, with fears. 2 days later, Miss Ordway appeared at our house, accompanied by Reverend Anderson. My father, surprised by the unexpected visit, invited the two to enter, offering the best bench in the living room, the one that wasn't broken. My mother, embarrassed by the simplicity of our house, ran to make coffee. I stayed in the corner of the room, almost hidden behind the kitchen door, listening, while Miss Ordway explained about the contest, about my winning essay, about the scholarship. She spoke eloquently about the unique opportunity it was, about how it could change my life, open doors that otherwise would remain closed. Your daughter is exceptional, Mr. Howard, she said, her voice full of conviction. She has a rare intelligence, a sensitivity, a capacity for expression that I've never seen in another student. It would be a waste not to give her this chance. My father listened to everything in silence, his face impassive, as always. When Miss Ordway finished, he turned to Reverend Anderson. And what do you think about this, Reverend? The Reverend, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, nodded gravely. I think it's God's will, Mr. Howard. This talent your daughter has, this opportunity that has arisen, are not coincidences. They are divine provisions. And who are we to go against God's will? I saw my father consider this, the religious argument clearly having more weight for him than any appeal to education or the future. Finally, he turned to my mother. Dorothy, what do you think? My mother, who had served the coffee and sat quietly in a corner, looked at me with an expression I couldn't completely decipher. There was sadness there, a certain resignation, but also something more. Pride, perhaps. Hope. I think she should go, my mother finally said, her voice low but firm. If God opened this door, who are we to close it? My heart leaped. They were considering, really considering letting me go. But who's going to help with the house? My father argued, furrowing his brow. Who's going to take care of George, help with the sewing? We'll manage, my mother answered, with a determination she rarely demonstrated in front of my father. Albert can help more. I can work a little more. We won't prevent our daughter from having a better chance in life just because we need her here. I was impressed with my mother at that moment. She, who had always been so submissive, so resigned to her fate, was fighting for my chance to have something different, something better. My father was silent for a long time, thinking. Finally, he sighed deeply. All right. If it's God's will, if it's the girl's chance to have a better life, she can go. I had to hold myself back from shouting with joy, from dancing around the room. Instead, I stayed quiet in my corner, tears silently running down my face. I was leaving. I was going to study. I was going to have a chance at a different life. The preparations for my departure began immediately. The school in Richmond would start the term in 2 weeks, and there was much to be done. Clothes to arrange, documents to provide, goodbyes to say. Albert was the first one I sought after the decision. I found him in the yard, chopping wood for the stove. I'm leaving, I announced without preamble. I won a scholarship to study in Richmond at St. Mary's School. He stopped what he was doing, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed like sadness. When? In 2 weeks, I replied. He nodded slowly, absorbing the news. It's good, he said finally. Good for you to get out of here, have a better chance. But what about you? And George, how will you be without me? He shrugged, trying to seem more confident than he really was. We'll manage. I'm almost a man. I can take care of George. I'm afraid, I confessed, my voice low. Afraid of what might happen when I'm not here. Albert put down the axe, approaching me with a serious expression. Don't need to be afraid, Trudy. I understood what you told me about Jeremiah, about what he did, and I promise that never, never will I be like him. I'll protect George like you protected me. I wanted to believe him. I really wanted to. But there was a persistent fear, a shadow that I couldn't completely push away. What if Albert changed without me around? What if that ghost, that evil influence of Jeremiah found a crack to enter our family again? It was then that I had an idea born of that power of words I had discovered. That ability to shape realities, to influence behaviors, to create and destroy alliances. Albert, I said, keeping my voice low, even though we were alone in the yard. There's something you need to know, something I never told anyone, not even you that day. He looked at me curiously. What? Before he died, Jeremiah told me something about you. It was a lie, of course, but a lie with purpose, with intention, with a greater objective than the simple truth. What did he say? Asked Albert, visibly tense. He said you would be next, that he had seen something in you, a similarity to him, that when he wasn't here anymore, you would take his place. Albert's face paled. That's not true. I would never be like him. I know, I hastened to say, putting my hand on his arm. I know you wouldn't be, but he thought you would. And that scares me, Albert. It scares me to think that he saw something in you that maybe even you yourself don't know exists. He took a step back, as if my words were a physical blow. There's nothing of him in me, Gertrude. Nothing. Then prove it, I challenged, looking fixedly into his eyes. Prove that he was wrong. Be different in everything. Be kind when he would be cruel. Be honest when he would lie. Be a protector when he would be a predator. Albert swallowed hard, nodding slowly. I'll prove it. You'll see. When you come back for vacation, you'll see that he was wrong about me. And George? I asked, pressing the point. Will you protect him like I protected you? With my life, he promised, his voice firm, despite his pale face. No one will touch him while I'm around. No one. I felt a cautious relief spread through my chest. The seed was planted. The alliance between Albert and Jeremiah's ghost, if it ever existed, was destroyed. Now there was a new alliance, a new promise, a new pact between Albert and George, between protector and protected. But there was still George. How to tell him I was leaving? How to ensure he would be okay, that he would understand, that he wouldn't feel abandoned? I found him the next afternoon, sitting by the creek that passed near our house, throwing pebbles in the water. I sat next to him in silence for a while, just watching the circles the stones made when they fell in the water. I have to go away for a while, George, I finally said, choosing my words carefully. I'm going to study at a school far from here. He stopped throwing stones, looking at me with those big, sad eyes he had had since the tragedy. For how long? Until vacation. Then I'll come back to visit, but I'll have to go back to school again. He nodded, processing the information. Is it because you don't like us anymore? The house? My heart tightened. Of course not. I love you more than anything. It's just that it's an opportunity, understand? A chance to study, to learn, to have a better future. Are you going to be a doctor? He asked. And there was a gleam of admiration in his eyes that caught me by surprise. I don't know, I answered honestly. Maybe a teacher like Miss Ordway. Or a writer. But whatever it is, one day I'll earn enough money to bring you and Albert to live with me in a good house, in a big city. Do you promise? He asked, his eyes lighting up with hope. I promise, I answered, taking his small hand between mine. But while that time doesn't come, you need to be strong. You need to study, help Mom and Dad, obey Albert. He nodded. Really? Albert said he's going to take care of me now, that he's going to be like you. I smiled, relieved to know that Albert had already talked with him, had already assumed the role of protector. And he will. But you also need to take care of him, understand? You are brothers. You need to take care of each other. He nodded again, seeming older, more mature than his 9 years. I'll miss you, Trudy. I'll miss you too, my little one, I answered, swallowing the knot that formed in my throat. But I'll write letters, many letters. And when I come back for vacation, I'll bring stories from places you've never seen, of people you've never met." He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his little face in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "Promise?" "Promise," I answered, sealing the pact with a tight hug. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations, of goodbyes, of anxiety and expectation. My mother sewed 2 skirts and 3 new blouses for me, using fabrics she had kept for special occasions. My father, in a rare gesture of affection, gave me a small wooden box that he himself had carved to keep important things. Miss Ordway gifted me with 3 books, a dictionary, a grammar, and an anthology of American poetry. And then, on a March morning, there I was, with my small cardboard suitcase, containing everything I owned in the world, ready to board the bus that would take me to Richmond, to a new life. The goodbye at the station was difficult. My mother cried, something she rarely did in public. My father, uncomfortable with displays of emotion, just squeezed my shoulder forcefully and said, "Make it worth it, girl." George clung to my skirt, sobbing until the last moment. And Albert? Albert hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything here. I'll make you proud of me." And then the bus arrived, huffing, imposing and frightening. I climbed the steps with trembling legs, found a seat near the window, and waved to my family as the bus began to move. First slowly, then faster and faster, taking me away from everything I knew, from everything I loved, from everything I feared. As I watched the houses of Milltown getting smaller and smaller until they disappeared on the horizon, I felt a confusing mixture of emotions. Fear of the unknown, of what awaited me at that boarding school in Richmond, sadness for leaving my family, especially my brothers who needed me so much, guilt for somehow escaping, leaving them behind. But there was also something else, a feeling I barely dared admit to myself. Relief. Relief for leaving that house where so many shadows still lived. Relief for leaving behind Jeremiah's ghost, my father's occasional looks after a few whiskeys, my mother's heavy silences. Relief for finally having the chance to be just Gertrude. Not the daughter, not the sister, not the victim, just myself, with all the possibilities that implied. And there was hope too. Hope that the alliance I had destroyed, that between Albert and Jeremiah's ghost, if it ever existed, would remain destroyed. Hope that the new alliance I had helped forge between Albert and George, based on mutual protection and care, would strengthen in my absence. Hope that the seeds I had planted, through the power of my words, would grow strong and healthy. The bus continued its way, cutting through fields and mountains, taking me to an uncertain future, but full of possibilities. And as I watched the landscape pass by, I felt something strange, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The sensation that, for the first time in my life, my destiny was in my own hands. I didn't know what awaited me in Richmond, at St. Mary's School, in the life that was to come. But I knew one thing for certain. Never again would I be a victim. Never again would I be silenced. Never again would I let evil in any of its forms destroy what I loved without fighting. The power of words had shown me this, that even in the darkest moments we have the capacity to influence, to change, to transform. And I carried this power with me like a secret weapon, a precious tool, a talisman against the shadows that would always threaten to return. The bus continued its course, and I continued mine, to where exactly only time would tell. But I was going, and that in itself was a victory. So many years have passed since that morning at the bus station. Today, at 83 years old, sitting on the porch of my house in Atlanta, looking at the flowery garden I planted with my own hands, I still remember everything as if it were yesterday. St. Mary's School in Richmond was my first step toward freedom. It wasn't easy at the beginning. The rigid rules, the mandatory silence during meals, the curious looks from the other girls at the newcomer from the countryside with simple clothes and a heavy accent. But there was something inside me, a strength that not even I completely knew, that made me go forward day after day. The nuns soon noticed my love for books, my thirst for knowledge. Sister Catherine, the librarian, became my first mentor, opening the doors to that paradise of books that was the school library. "Read everything, Gertrude," she would say. "Knowledge is the only good that no one can take from you." During vacations, I would return to Milltown. The first return was the most difficult. I was afraid of what I would find, of the changes that might have occurred in my absence. But to my relief, I found Albert fulfilling his promise. He had become George's protector, keeping him safe, helping him in school, being the older brother we never really had. "You're different, Trudy," Albert told me during that first visit. "There's a gleam in your eyes. You seem free." And it was true. Each month away from Milltown, away from that house, away from the shadows of the past, transformed me a little more. Like a plant that finally finds light after growing in the shadows, I bloomed. The years at the boarding school passed quickly. I graduated with honors, earning a new scholarship to continue my studies at Teachers College in Atlanta. I was going to become a teacher like Miss Ordway, my first inspiration. It was around this time that I received the news. My father had passed away. An accident at the mill, a machine that failed, a life that went out in an instant. I returned for the funeral, my heart heavy. Not with sadness, but with a complex feeling that I couldn't name. We had never been close, my father and I. He had never been cruel, but he had also never been truly present, truly protective, truly a father. At the funeral, I noticed how Albert, then 17 years old, firmly held our mother's hand. How he consoled George, then 13. How he had assumed the role of man of the house with a silent dignity that filled me with pride. My lie, my manipulation from years ago had borne fruits that I could never have predicted. It had created not a monster like Jeremiah, but a protector, a real man. After the funeral, my mother called me to a corner. "Your grandfather left a small house in town," she said. "I'm thinking of selling the homestead, moving there with the boys. Albert has already arranged a job at Mr. Johnson's store. George is doing well in school. It will be better for us." I agreed, relieved to know they would be in town, closer to resources, farther from the house where so many shadows still lived. I returned to Atlanta, to my studies, to the new life I was building. I sent money every month, visited when I could, kept in touch through letters. Gradually, the wound healed, never disappearing completely, but becoming a less painful mark, a reminder of what I had survived, of what I had overcome. I graduated from Teachers College and began to teach at a public school in Atlanta. I loved my work. I loved to see the children's eyes light up when they learned something new, when they discovered the transforming power of words and knowledge. It was at a teacher's party that I met Joseph. He taught mathematics at a nearby school, was a widower, had a gentle smile and eyes that inspired confidence. Our approach was slow, cautious, especially on my part. The horrors of the past had left deep marks, making it difficult to trust, to open up, to allow myself to be vulnerable. But Joseph was patient. He didn't pressure, didn't demand, didn't question. He was simply there, constant as a rock, gentle as a summer breeze. And gradually, very gradually, the walls I had built around my heart began to yield. The day I finally told him about my past, not everything, not the most sordid details, but enough for him to understand the scars I carried, he held my hands, looked into my eyes, and said, "Gertrude, you are the strongest person I've ever met, and I promise that as long as I live, no one will ever hurt you like that again." I believed him, and for the first time since those terrible days in Milltown, I allowed someone to really get close, really know me, really love me. We married on a spring Sunday in a simple ceremony at the neighborhood church. My mother came along with Albert and George. Albert, already a man of 22 years, working as a manager of the store where he had started as an assistant. George at 18, about to start law school thanks to a scholarship I had gotten for him through the school where I taught. It was one of the happiest times of my life. I had a job I loved, a husband who respected me and adored me, a family that, despite all the tragedies and difficulties, had found its way. The shadows of the past still appeared occasionally, in nightmares, in moments of insecurity, in exaggerated reactions to situations that reminded, even vaguely, of those terrible times. But they no longer controlled my life. They no longer defined who I was. We had a daughter, Helen, named in honor of my mother-in-law, and then, 3 years later, a son, Anthony, the name of my father-in-law. I raised my children with all the love, all the protection, all the freedom that I didn't have. I told stories, taught values, showed them the transforming power of words and knowledge. And always, always I was attentive to any sign, any indication that the shadows of the past might threaten my children. Not as an obsession, not as a paralyzing fear, but as a conscious vigilance, a fierce determination to break any cycle before it could even begin. The years passed. My mother passed away peacefully during sleep at 72 years old. Albert married, had 3 children, expanded the business that was now his, built a solid and respectable life in Milltown. George graduated in law, moved to Washington, D.C., became a respected lawyer, a defender of social causes. And Oscar? Ah, Oscar. For many years we knew nothing about him. It was as if he had disappeared from the face of the earth on that day he fled after Jeremiah's death. Until one day, almost 20 years later, I received a letter with a foreign stamp. "Dear sister," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well, happy, at peace. I'm writing from Argentina, where I've lived for many years. I built a life here, far from the past, far from the shadows. I have a wife, 2 children. I'm a carpenter. I work with my hands. I build instead of destroy." The letter continued, briefly telling about his life, his choices, his regret for the past, and ended with a request. "I don't ask for your forgiveness, Gertrude. I know that what I did, what I allowed to be done, is unforgivable. I just want you to know that I never forgot, never stopped regretting, never stopped hoping for your happiness." I cried reading those words. I cried for the boy Oscar had been, for the man he had become, for the horror we had shared, for the redemption he seemed to have found in his own way. I didn't answer immediately. I needed time to process, to decide if I wanted to reopen that door, re-establish that connection. Finally, months later, I sent a brief response, telling a little about my life, my family, avoiding touching directly on the past. I ended with, "I hope you have found peace, Oscar. I have found mine." We maintained sporadic contact since then, occasional letters, family news, always dancing around the shadows of the past without ever really directly confronting them. It was enough. It was what we could offer each other after everything that had happened. Life followed its course. My children grew up, got married, gave me grandchildren. Joseph and I aged together, sharing joys, overcoming difficulties, building a life that, although simple, was rich in love, in respect, in peace. When Joseph departed 5 years ago after a long battle against cancer, I thought I wouldn't survive the pain. But I survived as I had always survived, as I had learned to survive since those terrible days in Milltown. Today, at 83 years old, I look back and see a life that, despite its tragic beginning, was full, meaningful, victorious. I see the faces of my children, of my grandchildren, and I know that I managed to break the cycle, that the shadows of the past, as powerful as they were, didn't manage to extend to the next generation. That the power of words, that same power I discovered while still a girl, manipulating my brothers to protect myself and them, served in the end to create, to teach, to heal, and not to destroy. And what did I learn after all this journey? That we are stronger than we imagine, that the deepest wounds can heal even if they leave scars, that it's possible to find light even in the most absolute darkness, and that in the end, what defines our life is not the terrible things that happen to us, but how we choose to respond to them. That's what I wanted to share with you today, my dear viewers. This painful story, but also one of hope and overcoming. I hope that in some way it touches your hearts, makes you reflect, perhaps even helps someone who is going through difficult moments. If you liked my story, please leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel to follow more stories from grandparents like me, who carry deep marks, but also much wisdom to share. Thank you for listening to me. This grandmother here feels warm in her heart, knowing that she is no longer alone with her memories. God bless you all.